Let me start with something everyone recognizes. Prices go up. They don't jump all at once. They don't always feel dramatic, but over time, you notice it. Groceries cost a little more than they used to. Rent takes a bigger share of your income. Healthcare gets harder to afford. Education feels further out of reach. Even if you don't follow economic news, you feel it in daily life. Most people describe inflation as something that happened to them, something external, something unfair, and almost everyone agrees on one thing. They don't like it. So governments promise to fight inflation, central banks talk about controlling it, headlines warn about it, which leads to a very simple question. If inflation is such a problem, if it hurts consumers, if leaders across the world claim they want to stop it, why has it never gone away? Not in the United States, not in Europe, not in Japan, not in any modern economy. Prices keep rising, decade after decade, and that's not a coincidence. Most people don't experience inflation through charts or percentages. They experience it in very ordinary moments. At the grocery store, when the same basket of food costs a little more than last year. At the gas station, where prices never seem to come back down. When rent goes up again, even though the apartment hasn't changed. These moments feel personal. They don't feel like economic policy. They feel like something quietly slipping away. What makes inflation especially frustrating is how subtle it is. Nothing breaks overnight. There's no obvious collapse, just a slow erosion that's easy to ignore until you can't. People often describe it as falling behind, not because they're doing something wrong, but because the ground beneath them keeps moving. And when inflation shows up in the news, the message is usually the same. It's a problem. It's dangerous. It's something that needs to be stopped. So central banks raise interest rates. Politicians promise relief. Experts debate how bad it might get. But notice what never happens. No one seriously talks about a world without inflation at all. Not zero inflation for a few months. Not lower inflation next year. But a system where inflation simply doesn't exist. That idea barely shows up in public discussion, which should raise a question. If inflation is as harmful as we're told, why isn't eliminating it the ultimate goal? Why is the conversation always about controlling it and never about removing it entirely? That silence is where the real story begins. Most explanations of inflation follow the same script. We're told inflation happens because governments print too much money, or because central banks lose control, or because wars disrupt supply chains, or because corporations get greedy. Sometimes all of these explanations are true at the same time, but notice how inflation is always framed as a failure, as a mistake, as something that shouldn't exist in a well-run system. The underlying idea is simple. If leaders were more responsible, if institutions were more disciplined, if policies were designed better, inflation wouldn't happen. That story is comforting. It suggests inflation is temporary, fixable, the result of bad decisions that can be reversed. But there's a problem with that explanation. It doesn't match reality. Inflation exists across wildly different systems: capitalist economies, social democracies, highly regulated markets, free markets. It exists under conservative governments and progressive governments, during peace and during war, during growth and during recessions. And it always comes back, which raises an uncomfortable possibility. What if inflation isn't just a problem policymakers fail to solve? What if it's something the system quietly depends on? When people talk about inflation, they usually reach for the same explanations. You hear that inflation happens because governments print too much money, that central banks lose discipline, that politicians spend irresponsibly. This explanation is everywhere because it feels intuitive. If more money exists, prices must rise. If prices rise, someone must be at fault. Another common explanation is corporate behavior. Companies are greedy. They raise prices because they can. They use inflation as an excuse. That story feels satisfying, especially when people are struggling. Then there's the crisis narrative. Inflation is caused by war, by pandemics, by supply chains breaking. In this version, inflation is an external shock, something that hits the system from the outside and will eventually fade once the crisis passes. And finally, there's the promise that inflation is temporary. It's just a phase. It will come down next year. Things will return to normal. All of these explanations sound reasonable. They often contain pieces of truth, but they all share the same assumption that inflation is an abnormal condition, that it's something imposed on the economy rather than something emerging from it. What's rarely discussed is the possibility that inflation isn't just tolerated, but expected, that the system is designed with the assumption that prices will rise over time. This is why the language around inflation is so revealing. Central banks don't aim to eliminate inflation, they aim to anchor expectations. They don't promise zero, they promise stability around a positive number, which quietly reframes the issue. Inflation isn't treated as a failure to be erased, it's treated as a force to be guided. And once you notice that, it becomes harder to see inflation as a temporary problem caused by bad actors or unlucky events. Instead, it starts to look like something built into the way modern economies operate. That's the gap between what we're taught to believe and what the system actually does. Let's zoom out even further. Look at economic history over long periods of time, different decades, different political ideologies, different monetary systems. The details change. The pattern doesn't. Inflation rises, inflation falls, but inflation never disappears. Even the most inflation-averse institutions don't aim for zero. They aim for price stability, which almost always means some inflation, 2%, 3%. Sometimes higher. That's not accidental. If inflation were purely destructive, zero would be the goal. But it isn't, because an economy with no inflation behaves very differently. Imagine a world where prices never rise, where money gains value simply by being held. In that world, spending slows down, investment slows down, hiring slows down. People wait. Why buy today if tomorrow is cheaper? Why invest if holding cash is safer? That kind of economy doesn't collapse overnight. It freezes. And frozen economies don't generate growth. They don't absorb debt. They don't adapt. If inflation were just a mistake, someone would have eliminated it by now. The fact that no one has tells us something important. At this point, it helps to run a simple thought experiment. Imagine a modern economy where inflation truly disappears. Not lower inflation, not under control inflation. Zero. Prices don't rise year after year. They stay exactly where they are. At first, that sounds ideal. Your money keeps its value. Saving feels safe. Long-term planning feels easier. But slowly, something changes. If prices aren't rising, there's no urgency to spend. People delay purchases. Businesses see demand soften. Why buy today if waiting costs nothing? Investment starts to slow. If holding cash preserves value perfectly, taking risk becomes less attractive. Projects get postponed. Expansion plans are reconsidered. Hiring slows down. Wages stagnate. Growth loses momentum. Nothing collapses in a dramatic way. The economy doesn't explode. It just becomes rigid. And rigidity is dangerous in a system that relies on adaptation. This is why inflation shows up again and again across history, not as the same event, not at the same level, but with the same outcome. It returns. Different countries have tried different approaches. Some tightened money aggressively. Some imposed price controls. Some tied their currencies to gold or other anchors. The details changed. The result didn't. Inflation always found a way back into the system, and that persistence tells us something important. This isn't just about policy mistakes or poor leadership. If inflation were simply an error, it would have been engineered away by now. The fact that it hasn't been, despite centuries of economic experimentation, suggests that inflation plays a role deeper than we usually admit. It's not an occasional failure of the system. It's a recurring outcome of how the system is built. And once you see that pattern, the question shifts. It's no longer, why does inflation happen? It becomes, why does the system keep producing it? Modern economies are built on movement. Money has to move. Labor has to move. Capital has to move. Inflation quietly supports that movement in three key ways. 1. Inflation and spending. Inflation discourages hoarding. If holding money forever made you richer, people would stop using it. Spending would slow. Demand would shrink. Businesses would scale back. A small amount of inflation creates gentle pressure. It encourages people to spend, invest, or deploy capital instead of locking it away. That pressure isn't moral. It isn't fair, but it's functional. 2. Inflation and debt. Modern economies run on debt. Governments borrow to fund infrastructure and social systems. Businesses borrow to expand. Households borrow to buy homes, cars, and education. Inflation reduces the real value of old debt over time. That doesn't erase debt, but it prevents debt from becoming unbearable as economies grow. Without inflation, debt would become heavier every year. The system would choke on its own past. 3. Inflation and investment. Inflation changes incentives. It rewards productive risk over passive storage. If money loses value slowly over time, investing becomes rational. Businesses build. Innovation accelerates. Capital flows toward growth. Again, this doesn't mean inflation is kind. It redistributes purchasing power. It creates winners and losers. But from the system's perspective, inflation keeps the engine running. That's why inflation isn't eliminated, it's managed. Too much inflation breaks trust. Too little inflation freezes activity. The goal is balance. To really understand why inflation never goes away, we have to stop looking at it as a moral issue and start looking at it as a structural one. Modern economies are built around growth. That growth depends on three things moving forward at the same time: spending, debt, and investment. Inflation quietly shapes all three. Inflation and spending. Why money doesn't like to sit still. In a system with mild inflation, money slowly loses purchasing power over time. That changes behavior. It doesn't force people to spend immediately, but it nudges them away from doing nothing. If you hold cash for long periods, you fall behind. If you use it to buy, to build, to invest, you keep pace. This is why inflation is often described as a tax on idle money. Not because it's designed to punish people, but because the system rewards circulation over stagnation. An economy where money never moves is an economy that slowly stops producing. Inflation and debt. Why the past doesn't crush the future. Debt is not a side feature of modern economies. It's central to how they function. Governments borrow to build infrastructure. Businesses borrow to expand. Households borrow to buy homes and education. Inflation reduces the real weight of that debt over time. A loan taken today becomes easier to carry tomorrow if incomes and prices rise while the nominal debt stays the same. Without inflation, debt would only become heavier. Each year, yesterday's obligations would take up more and more space in today's economy. Growth would slow. Defaults would rise. The system would become fragile. Inflation acts as a release valve, not eliminating debt, but preventing it from freezing the system in place. Inflation and investment. Why risk is rewarded. Inflation also shapes where money flows. In a world without inflation, holding cash is a perfectly rational strategy. There's no pressure to deploy capital, no cost to waiting. But when inflation exists, doing nothing has a price. That pushes capital toward productive uses, into businesses, into infrastructure, into innovation. This doesn't mean every investment is good, or that inflation creates fair outcomes, but it does explain why systems tolerate it. Inflation aligns incentives toward movement, and movement is what modern economies are built to sustain. When you step back, inflation stops looking like a flaw that slipped through the cracks. It starts looking like a stabilizing force the system quietly relies on, not because it's good for everyone, but because without it, the system struggles to move at all. Once you understand this, inflation starts to look different, not as a temporary crisis, but as a permanent feature. That doesn't mean you have to like it, but it does explain why saving cash feels harder over time, why systems reward investment, why standing still with money is quietly punished. It also explains why inflation never truly goes away, because removing it would require redesigning the entire system, and modern economies are not designed to stand still. They are designed to move forward. This video is part of a series about how the economy really works beneath the surface. And once you see the structure, you stop waiting for inflation to disappear and start understanding the system you're operating inside. Once you see inflation this way, it stops feeling like a mystery and starts feeling like a signal. Not a signal that something is broken, but a signal of how the system is designed to behave. This is why saving money often feels frustrating. You do everything right. You work, you budget, you set money aside, and yet, over time, that money seems to fall behind. Not because you failed, but because the system quietly favors movement over stillness. Inflation is part of that pressure. It nudges people away from holding value in one place and toward participating in the broader economy. This doesn't mean everyone should take the same risks, or that everyone benefits equally. It means the system itself is structured around growth, not preservation. And that explains something else: why discussions about inflation rarely focus on eliminating it entirely. Instead, the focus is always on managing it. Too much inflation creates chaos. Too little inflation creates stagnation. The goal isn't perfection, it's momentum. When you understand this, you stop waiting for inflation to disappear, because it won't. Not without dismantling the structure that modern economies are built on. And once that realization sinks in, the more important questions start to change. Not when will inflation end, but how should I operate inside a system where inflation is permanent? That question leads to very different decisions about saving, about investing, about risk, about time. This video is part of a series about how the economy really works beneath the surface. And in the next video, we'll look at another piece of this structure: how interest rates interact with inflation and why that relationship shapes almost everything else.